We send humans to space wrapped in millions of dollars worth of technology, and it turns out the real survivor is moss. Yeah, the slimy stuff you slip on during your nature walk. Unlike us weakling humans, moss doesn't need a multi-billion-dollar space station, radiation-blocking spacesuits, or it turns out, even oxygen to survive in one of the harshest environments we know of. Welcome to the Goodish News channel. I'm Ashley, and I'm here to prove that there are still a few glimmers of good news out there. Sometimes we just have to go to space to find them. A team of scientists strapped moss to the outside of the International Space Station and just left it there for 9 months. And when they brought it back, to everyone's surprise, more than 80% of the spores were still alive. You might think that's not groundbreaking news, but this is the first time land plants have survived that long in true outer space. The work comes from researchers at Hokkaido University in Japan. We're going to go over what they did, what survived, and why a bunch of moss spores might matter for future space missions. And maybe even talk about whether life can spread through space. First, the experiment itself. The team worked with a species of moss called Physcomitrium patens. Scientists really like and use this moss a lot because it's simple, it grows quickly, and we know its genetics really well. Researchers prepared 3 kinds of samples, but the real stars of the story were the spores. If you're like most of us and you haven't thought about moss since middle school biology, spores are tiny dust-like particles moss uses to reproduce. Think of them like microscopic seeds with a built-in desire to survive. The researchers carefully dried the spores, packed hundreds of them into tiny sample holders, and loaded them onto a spacecraft headed for the International Space Station. Most plant studies on the ISS are done inside the station, not outside. But these little spores weren't so lucky. Instead, they were mounted on an external exposure facility on the outside of the station, where they'd face the vacuum of space and its harsh radiation and wild temperature swings. The spores stayed out there for 283 days, or just over 9 months. In early 2023, the samples were brought back down to Earth and taken into the lab to see what, if anything, had survived. If you're thinking, but how bad could space really be? Let's talk about how unfriendly that environment actually is. Outside the ISS, there's no air, and that means no air pressure, no moisture, and no atmospheric shield against radiation. Temperatures can swing from 250 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight to negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit in the Earth's shadow. I don't know what that is in Celsius because America, but just a second. Hey Siri, what's negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit in Celsius?
That would be negative 156.67 degrees Celsius.
There you go. Now throw in a constant stream of high energy particles and ultraviolet light, and you've got radiation that can break down DNA, damage cell membranes, and basically destroy everything that keeps a cell alive. If you put a human out there without a spacesuit, their body fluids would almost instantly start boiling. The person would lose consciousness in just a few seconds and would be considered deceased within a couple of minutes. Although considering the internal boiling, I'd say that's a very generous estimate. I wasn't kidding when I said we were weaklings. So it would probably be a safe bet to assume that plant spores wouldn't make it either. But that's a bet you'd lose. Most of them woke up. In fact, more than 80% of the moss spores were still viable after 283 days in space. They were able to repair themselves enough to stay alive. And even more surprising, when they were given the right conditions like water, nutrients, and light, the majority of those spores actually germinated. In other words, they were still capable of starting the next generation, despite being exposed to some insane conditions. The team then used those survival numbers to estimate how long spores like this might last if they stayed in space even longer. Their models suggest that in the right situation, some spores could potentially survive for up to 15 years in outer space. 15 years for a tiny dried plant cell in a place humans can't survive for more than a few seconds. So how is this even possible? Part of the answer is that moss has been training for this kind of thing for a very long time. Mosses are ancient plants. They were among the first to colonize land long before forests and flowers took over. They don't have true roots like most plants do. Instead, many species can dry out almost completely and go into a kind of suspended animation. When water disappears, they shut almost everything down, but when water comes back, they slowly restart. And the spores are especially tough. They're designed to wait, sometimes for years, until the conditions are right. Their DNA is tightly packed, reducing surface area and minimizing potential damage from the environment. This packing also helps prevent mutations. They're also surrounded by multi-layered cell walls, which shield them from being damaged. And in spore form, moss cells drastically reduce their metabolism by entering a dormant phase. They can basically wait out bad conditions. This built-in pause button for surviving bad conditions on Earth is also pretty handy for surviving the vacuum of space, especially when it comes to temperature shock and some forms of radiation. The key point here is this didn't happen by accident. Nature has been refining these little survival capsules for hundreds of millions of years. Space just happens to be a more extreme version of what they're already built to handle. This study is pretty cool, but moss isn't the first form of life to survive outer space. Tiny microscopic animals called tardigrades, sometimes nicknamed water bears, or my personal favorite, moss piglets, have survived being exposed to space for short periods of time. Certain bacteria and some lichens have also made it through similar tests, but this experiment is a milestone because it's the first time a land plant has survived this long. And why exactly should we care about a few moss spores clinging to the side of the ISS? First, future space missions. If we want to build long-term bases on the moon or Mars, we're going to need plants for things like food, oxygen, and psychological health. And that could be a video in and of itself. Knowing which species and which life stages can survive accidents, cold temperatures, or harsh conditions is incredibly useful. Spores and other dormant forms of life might help us design greenhouses and life support systems that can bounce back after problems occur, instead of needing to be rebuilt from scratch. Second, protecting other planets. If our moss can survive this well in space, it's a reminder that our spacecraft and hardware might carry more living hitchhikers than we expect. That could be a big problem when we're trying to make sure we don't accidentally contaminate Mars or the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn with Earth life. Finally, there's us. We often talk about how fragile life is, and it is. But discoveries like this show that life is also unbelievably stubborn. For 9 months, these dried moss spores clung to life in a place that should have been absolutely lethal, but they just quietly refused to die. If a little spore can survive the harsh vacuum of space, you can clean out your inbox and live to tell about it. If you're looking for more good news in your life, be sure to check out this video right here, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing so we can ignore all the bad news together.